In the year 1700, Britain had a problem no army could solve. It wanted everything China made. China wanted almost nothing Britain had to offer in return. For 100 years, that imbalance drained Britain's silver reserves. Ship after ship sailed east loaded with coin, and none of it ever came back. By the late 1700s, the East India Company was staring at a deficit so severe it threatened to sink the most powerful trading company on earth. So its directors did something that would addict millions, trigger 2 wars, and quietly fund an empire for the next 100 years. They found a product China's own government had outlawed and started selling it anyway, by the ton, through a supply chain built so no single hand looked dirty. That product was opium. This is the story of how one narcotic crop, grown under forced contract in India, reversed the flow of the world's silver and funded a third of Britain's presence in Asia. And the wreckage it left behind is still shaping the relationship between China and the West today. To understand how a drug deal became the financial backbone of British India, you have to start with the exact moment the company realized it was going broke and found the one commodity it believed could save it. 3 groups are about to collide over that decision: an empire desperate for silver, a government trying to protect its people, and millions of farmers who never got a vote in any of it. By the 1760s, tea wasn't a luxury in Britain. It was a national habit. Parliament taxed it heavily, which meant the government itself now depended on a steady Chinese supply. Tea duties alone were funding a meaningful share of the British treasury. If the tea stopped, so did the money. But China operated under the Canton system, all foreign trade funneled through a single port, and foreigners barred from selling almost anything China actually wanted. China ran a trade surplus with nearly the entire world on one simple principle: we have what you want, and you have little we need. Pay in silver. The Hong merchants, a licensed cartel of Chinese traders, controlled every transaction. Prices, quantities, terms. Foreign companies had no leverage at all. By the 1770s, the company wasn't just a trading firm anymore. Across Bengal, it was functioning as a government, collecting taxes, running courts, maintaining an army. That meant enormous, constant costs. And the silver needed to cover them kept disappearing east into China, never returning. In 1772, a catastrophic famine tore through Bengal, killing an estimated 10 million people, and gutting the tax revenue the company relied on to survive. The company was now bleeding money on 2 fronts at once: a shrinking tax base at home in India, and an endless silver drain abroad in China. Something had to close that gap, or the most powerful commercial enterprise in the world was going to collapse under its own ledger. That's when officials in Bengal noticed something quietly valuable. Opium had grown across parts of India for centuries, mostly for local medicine and modest recreational use. But there was already a market for it in China too, smaller, semi-legal, tolerated at the edges. And that market was growing on its own, with no help from Britain at all. If Britain couldn't sell China anything it wanted to buy in the open, maybe it could sell China something people wanted badly enough to buy in secret. In 1773, the company made it official. It declared a full monopoly over opium production in Bengal, the region under its most direct control. No farmer in the monopoly zone could grow poppy for anyone else. No merchant could buy it from anyone but the company. The entire supply chain locked from seed to sale. But there was one more problem. The company's own charter and its uneasy relationship with the Chinese state made it politically risky to sell opium into China directly under its own flag. So it built a workaround. The company would grow the opium, process it, and auction it off in Calcutta to private merchants, completely unconnected to the company on paper. Those merchants, known as country traders, would carry it to China and sell it themselves, technically as independent businessmen breaking Chinese law on their own. The company got its silver. The merchants got their profits. And if anyone in London or Canton asked hard questions, the official answer was always the same. The company itself never touched the trade at all. It was, in the words of one later historian, one of the most successful money laundering operations in the history of empire, run entirely in the open. By the 1780s, the plan was already working. Silver that had drained east for a century was finally starting to flow back, one chest of opium at a time. But that silver had to come from somewhere on the other end, too. And it wasn't coming from company land or company labor. It was coming from millions of Bengali farmers who were about to lose the right to choose what grew on their own land, and who would carry the human cost of this entire scheme long before a single ship ever reached Canton. The company called it a contract system. In practice, it functioned as something much closer to debt bondage, and it would trap entire villages inside it for the next century. Every growing season, company agents advanced farmers cash to plant poppy instead of food crops, rice, wheat, whatever the land had grown for generations. Once that advance was accepted, the farmer was legally bound. He could sell his entire crop only to the company, at a price the company itself set, almost always well below what the opium would fetch downstream. Refuse the terms or fall behind, and the debt simply carried forward to the next season, deeper each time, harder to escape. Land that used to feed a family now grew a crop that family could never legally eat, sell freely, or profit from, while food prices in the same villages quietly climbed. The processing itself happened at two massive government factories, one at Patton, one at Gazipur, where raw opium was pressed, dried, and packed by the ton under close supervision. By the early 1800s, opium had become one of the single largest exports produced anywhere in British India, grown by farmers who had almost no say in the arrangement at all. And on the other end of that supply chain, in the ports of Canton, a new class of merchant was about to get spectacularly rich, turning that crop into something China's own laws said should never have reached its shores at all. Their names would end up on banks, shipping lines, and family fortunes that still exist in some form today. But before we follow the money into those fortunes, it's worth sitting with what's already true at this point in the story. Britain hadn't invaded anyone yet. There had been no war, no treaty, no cannon fired. Just a trade deficit, a monopoly contract, and a supply chain engineered so that every person inside it could tell themselves they weren't really the one responsible. That's how empires usually do their worst work, not with a single dramatic decision, but with a slow, bureaucratic machine that nobody ever has to personally sign their name to. By 1800, that machine was running at full capacity. Chests of Bengal opium were crossing the Bay of Bengal by the thousands every year, and the merchants carrying them were about to turn Canton into the most profitable and most dangerous trading floor in the world. The company still couldn't touch the China end of this trade directly, so it needed men willing to do it in its place and take on all the legal risk themselves. Two of them would build the most famous name in the entire trade, William Jardine and James Matheson, founders of what became Jardine, Matheson and Co. Zeo Jardine had trained as a ship's surgeon before turning to trade. Matheson came from a family already deep in company circles. Together they built the most efficient opium smuggling operation China had ever seen. Their innovation wasn't the drug itself, it was logistics. Faster ships, better armed convoys, and a network of floating storage hulks anchored just outside Chinese jurisdiction. Those hulks, moored off islands like Linton, let merchants land opium fast, avoid direct confrontation with authorities, and keep the actual smuggling one careful step removed from Canton itself. From there, local Chinese smuggling networks and no small amount of bribed customs officials carried the product inland, deep into provinces the British never had to set foot in. Jardine Matheson wasn't alone. Dent and Company ran a rival operation just as large, and the competition between the two houses only pushed volumes higher. And one family in particular would turn this trade into a multi-generational fortune that stretched from Bombay to Shanghai to London, the Sassoons. David Sassoon had fled persecution in Baghdad and rebuilt his fortune in Bombay. His firm became one of the largest opium shippers between India and China, so dominant that people began calling Bombay Sassoon's town. Sassoon family opium profits eventually financed textile mills, banking ventures, and real estate holdings across 3 continents, the kind of fortune that outlives the trade that built it by well over a century. None of these merchants were breaking British law. Parliament had never made it illegal for a British subject to sell opium abroad. It was Chinese law they were breaking, and Chinese law they had no intention of respecting. The Qing government had banned opium as early as 1729 and reinforced that ban repeatedly. On paper, the trade Britain's merchants were running was a criminal enterprise from the very first chest. In practice, enforcement was patchy, corruptible, and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of money moving through it. Local officials who took bribes to look away often made more in a season than their entire annual salary. By the 1820s, the numbers had become almost impossible to ignore. Opium imports into China had roughly quadrupled in under 2 decades, and for the first time in centuries, the direction of the global silver trade had fully reversed. Silver was now flowing out of China, not into it, and Qing officials could see their own treasury draining in real time. Addiction was spreading too, through coastal cities first, then inland, cutting across every class, from dock workers to court officials, with no meaningful medical understanding of dependency to slow it down. Chinese officials had been debating what to do about this crisis for years, some arguing for legalization and taxation, others demanding total suppression. By the late 1830s, the suppression argument had won. The emperor needed someone he could trust to actually enforce it, someone incorruptible, in a system where corruption had become the entire point. In late 1838, he found that man. His name was Zexu, and within a year, his actions in a single port city would give Britain exactly the pretext it needed for war. But before we follow Lin Zexu to Canton, it's worth pausing on how completely normalized this trade had become on the British side by 1839. Opium wasn't a fringe smuggling racket anymore. It was funding banks, shipping empires, and, quietly, structurally, a growing share of British India's own government revenue. Removing it wasn't just a moral question for Britain. It was a budget question. And budget questions, as this story keeps proving, tend to win. So when Lin Zexu finally moved to physically destroy Britain's opium stockpiles at Canton, the merchants who lost their cargo didn't just see it as an insult. They saw it as a direct attack on a trade their own government had every financial reason to protect. And that's exactly the argument Jardine and his allies would carry back to London. Not protect our smuggling operation, but protect free trade and protect British honor. It worked. Within months, Parliament would authorize a war fought, on paper, over principle, and funded, in practice, by exactly the trade Lin Zexu was trying to stop. What happened next at Canton? The confrontation between one incorruptible Chinese official and an empire unwilling to lose its most profitable trade would set off a war that redrew the map of East Asia for the next 150 years. That war is where we go next. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839 with a mandate few officials in Qing history had ever been given full authority to end the opium trade by any means necessary. His first move was diplomatic. He wrote directly to Queen Victoria, appealing to her own moral authority, pointing out that opium was banned in Britain itself, and asking why it should be forced on China. That letter never reliably reached the Queen. What Lin Zexu did next reached London within weeks. He surrounded the foreign trading enclave at Canton and demanded every chest of opium in British hands be surrendered. Over 20,000 chests, representing a fortune in silver. After a tense standoff, the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot, ordered merchants to comply, but with a critical, calculated move. He promised them compensation from the British government itself. That single promise would turn a local customs dispute into a national war, because now every confiscated chest wasn't just a merchant's loss, it was a debt the British Crown itself now owed. In June 1839, Lin Zexu had the seized opium publicly destroyed at Hummun, mixed with lime and salt in trenches, and flushed out to sea over nearly 3 weeks. It was one of the largest single acts of drug destruction in recorded history, and in Lin Zexu's eyes, a triumph of principle over profit. In London, it was framed entirely differently, as an act of theft against British property, and an insult that demanded a military response. The debate in Parliament in the spring of 1840 was closer than most people remember. The vote to authorize war passed by only a narrow margin. Critics inside Britain itself, including a young William Gladstone, condemned the war as fundamentally unjust, a conflict fought to protect drug smugglers at gunpoint. But the merchants' lobby, backed by the financial reality of opium's role in imperial revenue, carried the vote. Britain would go to war to protect a trade its own government had quietly depended on for decades. The war that followed was staggeringly one-sided. British steam-powered gunboats, unlike anything China's coastal defenses had ever faced, moved up rivers the Qing Navy couldn't defend at all. City after city along the coast fell within months. Canton, Amoy, Ningbo, Shanghai, each engagement exposing how badly outdated Qing military technology had become. By the summer of 1842, British forces had pushed up the Yangtze River and threatened Nanking itself, the symbolic heart of the empire's south. The Qing court had no choice left but to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842, was the first of what China would come to call the unequal treaties, and its terms would echo for over a century. China was forced to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain outright. 5 ports, including Shanghai and Canton, were open to foreign trade whether the Qing government wanted it or not. China had to pay a staggering indemnity, partly to cover the war's cost and partly, with grim irony, to reimburse the very merchants whose opium had been destroyed at Human, and British subjects operating inside China were granted extraterritoriality, the right to be tried under British law, not Chinese law, no matter what they did on Chinese soil. Notice what's missing from that entire treaty. Not one clause mentions opium. The war that was fought over a drug ended with a settlement that never once had to name it. The trade itself remained technically illegal under Chinese law, which meant, in practice, that nothing about the underlying problem had actually been solved at all. Opium imports into China didn't fall after the war. They roughly doubled within a decade, because now British merchants operated with the protection of treaty ports, warships, and a demonstrated willingness to use force. Hong Kong itself, ceded almost as an afterthought in the treaty's terms, would grow from a sparsely populated island into one of the most important financial and shipping centers on Earth, a legacy of this exact war, lasting until the handover in 1997. But peace, if you could call it that, didn't last. Within 15 years, a second war would break out, this time explicitly finishing what the first one had left unresolved, making the opium trade fully, permanently legal. That war began almost absurdly over a single ship and a disputed flag. In October 1856, Chinese authorities boarded a ship called the Arrow, arresting its crew on suspicion of piracy. Britain claimed the ship was registered under British colors and demanded an apology it never really got. The registration, conveniently, had actually expired days earlier. It barely mattered. Britain had been looking for a pretext to force China back to the table, and the Arrow incident gave it one. This time, France joined the campaign too, using the murder of a French missionary as its own justification. A joint European force moved on China with far greater strength than the First War had ever seen. The Second Opium War, sometimes called the Arrow War, dragged on from 1856 to 1860, and it ended with one of the most symbolically brutal acts of the entire era. In October 1860, Anglo-French forces reached the outskirts of Beijing and, in retaliation for the mistreatment of captured negotiators, burned the old summer palace to the ground. Centuries of imperial art, literature, and architecture were destroyed or looted in a matter of days, an event still cited in China today as one of the rawest wounds of this entire period. With Beijing effectively defenseless, the Qing court had no leverage left. The resulting agreements, the Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking, went further than the First War ever had. 10 more treaty ports were forced open. Foreign diplomats could now reside permanently in Beijing itself. Christian missionaries were guaranteed protection to operate anywhere in China. And Kowloon, the peninsula facing Hong Kong Island, was ceded to Britain outright, expanding the colony that would remain under British control for over a century more. But the single most consequential clause for this story was much simpler than any of that. Opium was formally, explicitly legalized. After 2 wars, tens of thousands of deaths, and 2 decades of diplomatic fiction, pretending this was never really about a drug at all, the trade no longer needed euphemisms, workarounds, or country traders operating one careful step removed. It could now be imported, taxed, and sold completely in the open, and the Qing government, stripped of the authority to refuse it, was forced to formally tax the very substance it had spent decades trying to eliminate. Chinese opium imports surged again after legalization, and this time, domestic Chinese poppy cultivation exploded alongside them, as local growers raced to compete with the flood of Indian product. Within a few decades, China itself would become the largest opium producer on Earth, a bitter, self-inflicted irony born directly from a trade Britain had forced open at gunpoint. By the 1880s, an estimated 1 in 10 Chinese men used opium regularly, a public health catastrophe with roots tracing directly back to a trade deficit Britain had faced over 100 years earlier. And through all of it, the money kept flowing. Not just to merchant houses like Jardine Matheson and the Sassoons, but into the single largest institutional beneficiary of the entire scheme, the government of British India itself. By this point in the story, opium wasn't just funding merchant fortunes anymore. It had become a load-bearing pillar of an entire colonial government's budget. And that dependency is where the human cost of this trade reached its largest scale of all. That's where we go next, into the numbers that show exactly how much of the British Raj was, quite literally, paid for in opium. By the mid-19th century, opium revenue had become one of the largest single sources of income for the government of British India, at times reaching close to 1/6 of total state revenue. That money didn't just sit in a vault. It built the physical infrastructure of colonial rule, railways stretching across the subcontinent, telegraph lines, and the barracks and garrisons of the colonial army. Every mile of track laid to move troops and cotton across India carried, in some fraction, the profits of a trade forced onto another country entirely. This dependency created an uncomfortable incentive structure at the very top of the colonial government. The people responsible for administering India were now financially motivated to keep the opium trade with China running smoothly. Any disruption to that trade wasn't just a diplomatic problem. It was a direct threat to the colonial budget, which is exactly why Britain had gone to war twice already to protect it. Not everyone in Britain was comfortable with this. Anti-opium societies had formed as early as the 1870s, made up largely of missionaries, reformers, and members of parliament increasingly troubled by what the trade was doing to Chinese society. Missionaries working in Chinese port cities sent home detailed, often devastating accounts of addiction's toll on families, arguing that Britain's own Christian government had no business profiting from mass narcotic dependency abroad. Parliament debated the moral question repeatedly over the following decades. Motions to end the trade were introduced, argued passionately, and just as often quietly shelved. The reason was almost always the same one that had justified the war in 1840. Ending the trade meant ending a revenue stream the Indian government had structured its entire budget around. And nobody in London wanted to find that money elsewhere. It's worth pausing here on just how self-reinforcing this system had become. A trade deficit in 1770 had produced a monopoly. That monopoly had produced a war. That war had produced treaty ports and legalization. And legalization had produced a level of institutional financial dependency so deep that even genuine moral outrage back in Britain couldn't unwind it. Meanwhile, back in Bengal, the human machinery underneath all of this hadn't changed at all. Farmers were still bound to the same forced cultivation contracts their grandparents had signed decades earlier. The scale had only grown. By the 1870s, hundreds of thousands of acres across Bengal and neighboring regions were dedicated to poppy cultivation under company and later Crown administration. A second opium-producing system had also developed further west, in the princely state territories collectively known as Malway, competing with, and eventually partly absorbed into the same colonial tax structure. By the late 19th century, opium revenue from India was arriving in London so reliably that it had effectively become a permanent line item, treated less like a controversial trade and more like an unremarkable tax bracket. That normalization is, in some ways, the most unsettling part of this entire chapter. A drug trade built on forced cultivation and foreign addiction had become so thoroughly institutionalized that it no longer registered as extraordinary to the people running it. It took China's own reform movement, decades of accumulating public health catastrophe, and a changing global mood around drug regulation in the early 20th century to finally start winding this system down. In 1907, Britain and China finally agreed to a 10-year plan to phase out the India to China opium trade entirely, a slow, negotiated unwinding of a system that had taken over a century to build. By the time it formally ended, the opium trade had shaped the finances, the borders, and the collective memory of two empires, and its consequences were nowhere close to finished. What happens after the trade itself ends is, in many ways, the part of this story that still shapes the news today. In China today, the opium wars aren't a footnote. They're the opening chapter of what's taught, formally, as the century of humiliation, the starting point of a national narrative that runs directly through to the present day. That framing isn't incidental. It's foundational to how modern China's government explains its own rise, a story of a once dominant civilization humiliated by foreign powers and now finally restoring its rightful place in the world. Every trade dispute, every sovereignty argument, every moment of friction between China and Western powers today gets read by a meaningful part of Chinese public opinion through the lens of this exact history. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It's explicitly, repeatedly invoked in Chinese state media, education, and political rhetoric, the Opium Wars, as the moment foreign powers first proved they'd force their will on China by violence. And Hong Kong itself is the clearest physical proof of how long that history's shadow actually stretches. Seeded in 1842 for a war fought over a drug, expanded in 1860 for a second war fought to legalize it. Hong Kong remained under British control for 155 years, until the handover at midnight on the 1st of July 1997, that handover wasn't just an administrative transfer of territory. In Chinese state framing, it was the formal, symbolic closing of the wound the Opium Wars had opened a century and a half earlier. But territory wasn't the only lasting legacy this trade left behind. The infrastructure it built, the smuggling routes, the cultivation networks, the criminal and financial systems designed to move a banned narcotic across borders undetected, didn't simply disappear once the trade was formally wound down. Some of it migrated. Poppy cultivation that had once concentrated in Bengal and the princely states of India found new footholds in the mountainous borderlands of Southeast Asia, a region that would eventually become known as the Golden Triangle. A similar pattern took root further west, across Afghanistan and its neighboring regions, in what would later be called the Golden Crescent. Neither region invented opium cultivation independently of this history. Both inherited the trade networks, the demand structures, and in some cases the literal cultivation techniques that colonial-era opium administration had spent over a century perfecting. Historians still debate exactly how directly to draw that line, but the through line is hard to dismiss entirely. The modern global drug trade didn't emerge from nowhere. Its earliest large-scale template was a state-run monopoly built by an empire to solve an 18th century trade deficit. There's a version of this story that reduces it to a single sentence. Britain got China addicted to pay its bills. That version isn't wrong, exactly. But like most reductions, it flattens 150 years of decisions made by hundreds of different people into a single villain and a single victim. The East India Company's directors who first proposed the monopoly weren't thinking about addiction in China. They were thinking about a balance sheet. The Bengal farmers who grew the crop weren't villains either. They were often trapped in a contract system with no meaningful alternative, carrying debt that outlived their own harvests. Jardine, Matheson, the Sassoons, they were businessmen operating in a moral vacuum their own government had deliberately engineered, profiting from a gap between what was legal in Britain and what was tolerated in China. And the parliament that voted for war wasn't thinking primarily about drugs at all. It was thinking about a trade deficit that had somehow, over 70 years, transformed into a matter of national prestige. What ties every one of those decisions together isn't a single villain pulling every string. It's a pattern this channel keeps coming back to, again and again, across completely different centuries and continents. When an empire runs out of money, it doesn't stop and reconsider its ambitions. It looks for whatever it can sell, tax, or extract, and it deals with the moral cost of that decision only after the money is already flowing. The people who pay for that decision are almost never the ones who made it. It's tempting to file all of this away as distant 19th century history. Tragic, but finished. The treaties are 2 centuries old. The trade itself ended over 100 years ago, but the underlying argument never actually closed. Strip away the specific commodity, and the core dispute at the heart of the Opium Wars is a question nations are still fighting over today. Does a more powerful economy get to force open a weaker one's markets? On its own terms, regardless of what that weaker nation's own laws or government actually want? That question sat underneath 19th century gunboat diplomacy. It sits underneath modern trade war rhetoric too. Tariffs, sanctions, market access demands, all argued today in courtrooms and trade negotiations instead of with warships. The tools changed completely. The underlying leverage dynamic, a stronger economy dictating terms to a weaker one, and calling the result free trade, is recognizably the same argument wearing modern clothes. China's leadership knows this history intimately and references it deliberately in modern diplomacy, not as a historical aside, but as active political context for how it frames Western pressure today. When you hear Chinese officials talk about national sovereignty, non-interference, or resistance to what they call unequal international arrangements, that language traces a direct rhetorical line back to 1842. It's not an accident of phrasing, it's a deliberate historical callback, understood instantly by any Chinese audience, and largely invisible to Western audiences who never learned this chapter of the story in the first place. That gap in understanding is in its own way a legacy of this history too. One side remembers a war fought over principle and a trade dispute settled by treaty. The other remembers a century of enforced humiliation that hasn't fully ended in its own telling. Meanwhile, the physical and financial infrastructure this trade built didn't disappear either. Hong Kong remains one of the most important financial centers on Earth, a role it inherited directly from its founding as a colonial trading outpost in 1842. The banking and shipping fortunes built on opium. Profits evolved, diversified, and in some cases still operate in recognizable form today. Legitimate institutions with origin stories most of their modern customers have never heard. And the drug trafficking networks this system helped originate in Southeast Asia and Central Asia remain in evolved form, part of the global narcotics trade that governments are still fighting today, a fight that traces its earliest large-scale template directly back to a state-run opium monopoly. So when this channel keeps returning to stories like this one, an empire, a budget crisis, a decision that seemed small and bureaucratic at the time, it isn't just because the history is dramatic. It's because these decisions never actually stay in the past. They get built into borders, into financial centers, into national grievance narratives, into the language governments still use to justify pressure on each other today. A trade deficit in 1770s, London eventually produced a war, a colony, a century-long revenue stream, a national grievance narrative still taught in Chinese schools today, and a drug trafficking template still shaping global crime 150 years later. Nobody in 1773 signing off on a modest opium monopoly to close a budget gap could possibly have imagined any of that, which might be the most unsettling lesson of all. Empires rarely set out to cause the damage that ends up defining their legacy. They just keep making small, defensible, budget-driven decisions and let history sort out, decades or centuries later, exactly what those decisions actually cost. If you made it this far, drop a teacup in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It genuinely helps this kind of deep dive keep getting made. I'll see you in the next one.